Snow covered the road back to White Harbor like nothing painful had ever happened there. Nate Callahan came home with only one hope left: to see his family again. But at the gate of his own house, his name was gone. His wife stood inside with another man, and every paper said he no longer belonged. Only Valor, his old German Shepherd K9, stayed beside him without asking for proof. And in the silence of that winter town, Nate would discover that home is not always what we return to. Sometimes it is what we rebuild after everything breaks. If this story touches your heart, tell us where you're watching from and what home means to you. Please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 5,000 subscribers so we can keep writing more meaningful stories for you. The snow was bright enough to hurt his eyes. Nathaniel Callahan had forgotten that about Vermont winters, not the cold. He remembered the cold well enough. Cold had lived in his bones in places far from home, in tents, on airstrips, in the hollow pauses before dawn. But this kind of brightness was different. It did not threaten. It welcomed. It covered the roofs of White Harbor in clean, white silence, gathered on the shoulders of pine trees, softened the old road signs, and turned the frozen lake beyond town into a sheet of pale blue glass. For a few miles, Nate let himself believe in that welcome. He drove slowly, both hands steady on the wheel of the old dark pickup he had bought 3 states back. Beside him, Valor sat upright in the passenger seat, muzzle lifted toward the cracked window, his amber eyes taking in every passing fence line and snow-buried mailbox. The German Shepherd was 9 now, old enough for silver to show around his mouth, old enough for his movements to carry a little stiffness in the morning. But nothing about him had gone soft. His ears still stood sharp, his chest was still deep, his gaze still missed almost nothing. Nate reached over and rested 2 fingers on the dog's collar. "Almost there," he said. Valor did not wag his tail. He simply turned his head and looked at him, as if checking whether Nate believed his own words. Nate almost smiled. He had said those words before. Almost there. On long drives between bases, outside field hospitals, on dark roads after missions nobody talked about later. Sometimes the words had meant safety. Sometimes they had meant only another place to stand and keep going. Today, he wanted them to mean home. He was 52 years old, though there were mornings when his body felt older, and moments when some wounded, younger version of himself still looked out through his eyes. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, lean from habit rather than vanity. His face was clean-shaven, the square line of his jaw exposed to the cold, his cheekbones sharpened by tiredness and winter air. Dark brown hair, cut short in the old military style but grown just a little past regulation, sat neatly beneath a faded knit cap. His gray-blue eyes stayed on the road longer than necessary. The road to the Callahan house curved along the northern edge of town, past the white church, the closed summer bait shop, and the line of old maples that had stood there since his boyhood. Snow lay smooth over everything. It made the town look innocent. White Harbor had always been small enough to remember a man, but not always kindly. Nate knew that. Still, as the familiar streets passed by, he found himself looking for pieces of his old life with a hunger he did not want to admit. The diner where his mother used to buy cinnamon rolls on Sundays. The hardware store where his father had argued about nails as if the whole republic depended on them. The frozen hill where boys used to sled down too fast and lie about being scared. And beyond all that, the house. He had not allowed himself to imagine it too clearly during the last stretch of the drive. Imagination was dangerous. It added warmth to things before the world had agreed to provide it. But now that the turnoff was ahead, images came anyway. Marissa standing in the kitchen with her hair pinned loosely, pretending not to be crying. His mother, June, holding his face in both hands. His father, Walter, saying something gruff because emotion had always embarrassed him. Valor running across the back lawn, free of leashes, free of commands, free of the old life. Nate swallowed and turned onto Callahan Road. The tires crunched over packed snow. Pines rose on both sides, their branches heavy and glittering. The old stone wall appeared first, half buried beneath drifts. Then the iron gate came into view. Nate slowed. For a moment, he did not understand what was wrong. The gate was there. The stone pillars were there. The long drive beyond it curved toward the house just as it always had. Then he saw the lock. It was new. Black, heavy, industrial. Not the old brass one his father had cursed every winter because it froze shut. This one looked expensive and recent, too clean against the weathered iron. Nate put the truck in park. Valor's posture changed before Nate opened the door. The dog's ears angled forward. His body went still in that old working dog way, not alarmed exactly, but alert to the shift in Nate's breathing. "It's all right," Nate murmured. The words sounded thin. He stepped out into the cold. Snow came up over the edges of his boots. His olive tactical shirt was hidden beneath a worn field jacket, and the cuffs, faded from years of washing, showed beneath the sleeves. His combat pants, earth brown and softened at the knees, brushed against the snow as he walked to the gate. He touched the lock with one gloved hand. New. He looked toward the mailbox beside the road. The Callahan name was gone. For several seconds he only stared. The metal plate that had held the family name for decades had been removed. In its place was a sleek black plaque with neat silver lettering. Voss Property Management. The cold seemed to move through the front of his jacket and settle under his ribs. Valor came to stand beside him. The dog sniffed once at the base of the gate, then raised his head, eyes fixed down the drive. Nate followed his gaze. There were tire tracks in the snow. Fresh ones. Wide, clean. Not from his truck. They curved up toward the house, pressed deep into the white. He reached through the bars and pushed the gate. It did not move. Locked from the inside. A foolish thought came to him then, small and desperate. Maybe Marissa had done it for security. Maybe the mailbox had been replaced because of some rental office mistake. Maybe the name meant nothing. Maybe the world had not rearranged itself without him. He took out his phone and found Marissa's number. His thumb hovered over it. Before he could call, the front door of the house opened. Even from the gate, he recognized her. Marissa Callahan stepped onto the porch in a cream-colored sweater and dark-fitted trousers, wrapped in a pale wool coat that made her look almost untouched by the cold. Her hair, honey brown and smooth to her shoulders, moved lightly in the wind. She did not run toward him. She did not lift a hand to her mouth. She did not break. She stood very still. Behind her, a man appeared in the doorway. Younger than Nate, maybe late 30s, clean, polished, wearing a black overcoat and boots that had never done a day's work in slush. He placed one hand on the door frame with the casual confidence of a man standing inside a house he believed belonged to him. Nate felt Valor's shoulder press against his leg. That small weight, familiar and warm, kept him where he was. Marissa walked down the porch steps and along the drive. The man followed at a slower pace, not close enough to seem protective, but close enough to make his presence clear. When she reached the other side of the gate, her eyes moved over Nate quickly. The old jacket, the duffel in the truck, the tired face, the dog. Whatever she saw, it did not soften her. "Nate," she said. No surprise, no relief, not even anger. Just his name, spoken like an appointment she had hoped to avoid. Marissa. His voice came out lower than he expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The bright snow around them made the silence feel public, exposed. Nate looked past her, up the drive, to the house. The place rose against the winter sky with its wide porch, tall windows, and gray stone chimney. The Callahan house had never been a mansion in the grand way strangers imagined, but it had been large, old, and full of family labor. His grandfather had built the first wing. His father had added the workshop. Nate had painted the porch the summer before he married Marissa. There was a wreath on the door now that he did not recognize. "Why is the gate locked?" he asked. Marissa looked down briefly, as though disappointed by how simple the question was. "Because this is private property." Nate waited, thinking he had misheard her. "What?" The man behind her stepped closer. "Mr. Callahan, maybe this would be better handled through counsel." Nate's eyes shifted to him. "And you are?" The man smiled with professional restraint. "Graham Voss." The name meant nothing to Nate, and somehow that made it worse. Marissa folded her arms. "Graham has been helping manage the property." "The property," Nate repeated. His voice remained calm, but something inside him had gone very quiet. Marissa took a breath. "Nate, you signed papers before your last assignment. You gave me authority to handle financial matters. There were debts, taxes, repairs, your father's medical expenses, things you were not here to deal with." "I signed limited power of attorney," Nate said, "for bills, insurance, house maintenance. And it became more complicated than that." "No." Nate's hand tightened around the cold iron bar. "It didn't become anything. Not without me." Marissa's face changed, not with guilt, but with the faint impatience of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times and disliked that he was not following the script. "Everything was done legally." The sentence struck harder than shouting would have. Legally. A clean word for something filthy. Nate looked at the house again. In one upstairs window, curtains he did not know hung where his mother's blue ones used to be. The porch swing was gone. The old split-log bench near the front steps had been replaced by a black metal planter. Small things. Ordinary things. But each one told him the same story. Someone had been living here without him, changing things, removing evidence that he had ever belonged. "Where are my parents?" he asked. For the first time, Marissa looked away. It was brief, barely a blink, but Valor saw it. The dog's ears sharpened, and a low breath moved through his chest. Marissa recovered quickly. "They left." "Left where?" "Nate, where are they?" The question came out harder, not loud, but edged. Graham shifted his weight. Valor turned his head toward him with such precise stillness that the younger man stopped moving. Marissa's mouth tightened. "They went to stay with relatives. They couldn't manage the house anymore." "My father would have told me." "He tried," she said, and there was something almost cruel in how softly she delivered it. "But you weren't exactly reachable, were you?" Nate stared at her. Snow slid from a pine branch somewhere behind him and landed with a soft thump. Marissa continued, her voice careful now, almost sympathetic in a way that felt worse than contempt. "You were gone for years, Nate. Even when you called, you weren't really there. You know that. We all knew that." The words found old wounds with terrible accuracy. He saw flashes he did not want, missed calls, nights when he could not bring himself to speak, messages left unanswered because he had been sitting in darkness trying to remember how to breathe like a normal man. He had not been easy to love, he knew that. War had followed him home before his body ever did. But absence was not abandonment, and pain was not permission. "My mother wouldn't leave without saying goodbye," he said. Marissa's expression hardened. "Your mother was tired of watching what you were becoming." The world narrowed. Not from rage. Rage would have been easier. Rage would have given him somewhere to put his hands, his voice, his body. This was different. This was the feeling of a floor giving way beneath him while he remained standing. Valor moved then, not forward in attack, not with a bark. The German shepherd simply stepped in front of Nate, placing his body between him and the gate. His black and gold coat caught the winter light. The old scar on his left ear showed clearly. One paw rested near the toe of Nate's boot. A signal. Stay here. Stay present. Nate looked down at him. Valor did not look back. His amber eyes remained fixed on Marissa and Graham, calm but unyielding. For the first time since arriving, Nate understood that the dog was not only guarding him from them. Valor was guarding him from himself. Because there was a version of Nate, not far beneath the skin, that wanted to tear the lock off the gate, march up the drive, and demand the truth from every wall in that house. There was a version of him that wanted to prove loudly and violently that he had not vanished, that he had bled and served and endured and come home with the right to stand on his own land. But that was the version Marissa would know how to use, the unstable veteran, the broken husband, the dangerous man at the gate. Nate slowly released the iron bar. The movement was small. To anyone else, it might have meant surrender. To Valor, it meant survival. Graham cleared his throat. I think it would be best if you left. Nate looked at him then, really looked. The polished coat, the clean boots, the faint shine of a watch at his wrist. A man dressed for ownership, not work. Nate wondered if Graham had ever split wood behind that house in January, ever held a ladder for Walter in sleet, ever sat with June on the porch while thunder rolled over the lake. No, of course not. Men like Graham did not inherit places through memory. They acquired them through documents. Nate turned back to Marissa. Did I sign the house away? Her answer came too quickly. Yes. All of it? You authorized me to make decisions. That isn't what I asked. Her eyes cooled. You signed enough. There it was. Not the whole truth, not even a convincing lie. Just enough. The phrase settled into Nate's mind like a stone dropped into deep water. You signed enough. Enough for whom? Enough for a lawyer? Enough for a bank? Enough for a wife who no longer wanted to wait? Enough for a stranger in a black coat to stand inside the door his father had hung by hand? Nate nodded once, though he was not agreeing. He stepped back from the gate. Marissa seemed to exhale, perhaps relieved he had not made a scene. That relief wounded him more than her words. She had expected him to break badly. Part of her had prepared for it. Instead, he opened the rear door of the pickup and pulled out his old duffel bag. It was olive green, scarred by years of travel, one strap repaired with black tape. Everything he had brought home fit inside it. Valor returned to his side. For a moment, Nate stood facing the house. Behind the windows was the life he had pictured during every lonely mile of the drive. Warm kitchen light, his mother's voice, his father's rough hand on his shoulder. Marissa, not as she was now, but as she had been once, laughing barefoot in summer grass. The house held all those ghosts. But none of them came to the door. Nate turned away first. He did not slam the truck door. He did not curse. He did not give Graham the satisfaction of seeing his hands shake. He placed the duffel on the seat, opened the passenger door for Valor, and waited as the old dog climbed in with careful dignity. Before getting behind the wheel, Nate looked one last time at the mailbox. Voss Property Management. The silver letters gleamed against the black plaque, clean and certain. Nate reached up beneath his shirt and touched the worn metal of his old dog tag. The engraved name had faded at the edges, but it was still there. Callahan. For now, that was all he had. He climbed into the truck. Marissa remained behind the gate, pale against the snow. Graham stood a few steps behind her, already looking toward the house as if the interruption were over. Nate started the engine. The truck rolled backward, tires grinding over the packed white road. Valor sat beside him, silent, watchful, one paw pressed lightly against Nate's thigh. Only when the gate disappeared behind the line of pines did Nate let his breath leave him. It came out uneven. The road ahead was bright, empty, and unfamiliar despite being the same road he had known all his life. Snow glittered on the fields. Smoke rose from chimneys in town. Somewhere people were making coffee, feeding dogs, arguing over breakfast, living inside homes that still knew their names. Nate kept driving. Beside him were Valor, an old duffel bag, and the weight of a question he did not know how to answer. If the place you called home no longer recognized you, where did you belong? Nate did not go back to the gate the next morning. That was the first decision he made with a clear head. The night after leaving Callahan Road, he had slept badly in the cab of his truck behind a closed gas station, the heater running only when the cold became too sharp to ignore. Valor had curled in the passenger seat, too large for the space, his black and gold body folded with practiced patience. Every few hours, the dog lifted his head and looked at Nate as if counting his breaths. Nate had wanted to drive back before dawn. He had imagined parking outside the gate, waiting until Marissa came out, demanding names, documents, dates. He had imagined cutting the lock. He had imagined walking up the drive and standing on the porch until someone called the sheriff. And that was exactly why he did not go. By morning, the anger had cooled into something more dangerous: clarity. Marissa had not only taken the house, she had prepared a story. Nate could feel the shape of it around him already. A former military man, years away, trouble sleeping, quiet in the wrong way, a dog trained for danger, a marriage that had become difficult. If he raised his voice, if he grabbed the gate, if he lost control for even 1 minute, he would become the man she needed him to be. So he drove into White Harbor instead. The town looked harmless under fresh snow. Storefront windows glowed gold against the pale morning. Someone had tied red ribbons around the lampposts along Main Street, and the frozen lake beyond the buildings shone like polished steel. The beauty of it felt almost insulting. Nate parked near the public library and opened his banking app with fingers stiff from cold. The number on the screen was worse than he expected. Not empty, but close enough to make every cup of coffee feel like a decision. Valor watched from the passenger seat. "I know," Nate muttered. "Should have checked before crossing 3 states." The dog blinked once, unimpressed. Nate shut the phone off. He still had his discharge papers, his military ID, a few folded documents in the duffel, some clothes, a shaving kit, and the old metal dog tag under his shirt. What he did not have was a lawyer, an address, proof that would matter immediately, or enough money to make righteous anger useful. By noon, he had asked at 4 places for work. The first man, who owned a hardware store with a cheerful bell over the door, looked Nate up and down and said business was slow after Christmas. The second said he might need help in March, once the thaw started. The third recognized his last name and suddenly became careful. "You're Walter Callahan's boy, right?" the man asked. Nate said yes. The man's expression shifted, not into welcome, but into that uneasy small-town look people used when they knew something, but did not know whether they were supposed to say it. "Heard you were back," he said. "I am." "Heard things got complicated." Nate stared at him until the man looked away. By mid-afternoon, Nate had made $8 carrying salt bags for an elderly couple and another $20 clearing ice from the back steps of a florist shop. His gloves were damp. His shoulders ached. Valor stayed near him, patient and silent, occasionally accepting a cautious compliment from someone who admired him from a distance, but did not come too close. The work itself did not shame Nate. He had never been afraid of labor. He had dug, lifted, dragged, repaired, hauled, and endured in places where nobody cared what a man had once owned. What hurt was the way people looked at him now, as if the story had arrived before he did and was standing between them. By late afternoon, snow began falling again. Nate was outside the service station on Harbor Road, using a borrowed shovel to clear a blocked drainage path, when a voice barked from inside the garage. "You planning to move that snow or negotiate with it?" Nate looked up. An older man stood in the open bay, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been cleaned sometime in the previous decade. He was broad in the middle, thick through the shoulders, with a gray beard that looked trimmed by weather rather than scissors. A black knit cap sat low over his forehead. His work jacket was brown canvas, darkened at the cuffs by oil and age. Nate recognized the station, though not the man at first. Bramwell Auto and Towing had been there since Nate was young. Back then, the owner had been Otis Bramwell's father, a hard-drinking man with a laugh that shook windows. "You Otis?" Nate asked. The man squinted. "Depends who's asking." "Nate Callahan." Otis studied him for a long moment, then looked at Valor. The dog stood near the truck, ears forward, neither friendly nor threatening. "Dog bite?" "Only with reason." Otis grunted. "Better than most people." He disappeared into the garage. Nate assumed the conversation was over and returned to the snow. A minute later, Otis came back, carrying a metal thermos cup. He held it out. "Coffee's bad," he said. "Hot, though." Nate accepted it. "Thanks." Otis watched him drink, then nodded toward the back of the building. "Room behind the parts cage has a cot. Furnace works when it feels respected. Door sticks if you pull instead of lift." Nate lowered the cup slightly. "I'm not asking for. Didn't say you were. I can pay." "Can you?" Nate did not answer. Otis gave a dry snort. "Then shovel the front after storms, help with tows when I call, and keep that dog from eating customers." Valor looked at him as if personally offended by the suggestion. For reasons Nate could not explain, the look on Valor's face nearly made him laugh. Otis turned back toward the garage. "Keys on the nail by the office. Don't make a speech. I hate speeches." That was how Nate got a room. It was barely a room at all, more like a storage space someone had cleared in a moment of reluctant mercy. One narrow cot, a metal shelf, a small window looking toward the alley. The furnace pipe clanged in the wall every time heat moved through it. The concrete floor stayed cold no matter how long the heater ran. To Nate, it was better than the truck. He set his duffel beneath the cot and folded his jacket at the foot. Valor circled twice, inspecting the corners, then lay down across the doorway as if establishing a perimeter. Nate stood in the center of the room, unsure what to do with the quiet. There were no family photographs here, no porch, no familiar kitchen, no smell of his mother's bread or his father's sawdust. Just oil, rubber, old cardboard, and the distant sound of Otis dropping tools onto metal. Still, there was a key in Nate's hand, a temporary key, a borrowed key, a key that opened almost nothing. But it opened this door. He closed his fist around it and felt, against his will, the smallest movement of gratitude. The days that followed did not become easier. They became organized. That was different. Nate learned which stores needed sidewalks cleared before opening and which ones paid in cash. He learned that the feed store needed help unloading twice a week, that the marina still had boats under winter covers that tore loose in storms, that a widowed farmer named Mr. Haskell paid $10 more if Nate repaired fences without being asked to talk. He shoveled snow until his hands cracked. He hauled firewood until his back tightened. He lay under dead engines while slush dripped onto his cheek. He helped Otis drag a delivery van out of a ditch, then spent 2 hours replacing a cracked belt on a plow truck while Valor slept under a workbench with one eye open. The work gave shape to the days. It did not yet give meaning. Rumors followed him in soft, indirect ways. Nobody accused him of anything to his face. White Harbor was too polite for that, or too cowardly. But conversations thinned when he stepped into the diner. A woman at the post office asked if he was staying long, in a tone that meant something else. 2 men outside the hardware store stopped talking when Valor's tags jingled. Once, while stacking split birch behind a restaurant, Nate heard a man say through the half-open kitchen door, "Marissa always said he came back different." Another voice answered, "War does that." The first said, "Different can mean dangerous." Nate kept stacking wood. One piece, then another, then another. Valor rose from the snow and crossed to him. The dog did not bark toward the kitchen. He did not react to the voices. He simply pressed his shoulder against Nate's leg and stood there until Nate's grip on the wood loosened. Nate looked down at him. "I heard it," he said quietly. Valor's eyes remained steady. "Yeah," Nate said. "I know you did too." That evening, back in the room behind the garage, Nate skipped dinner without deciding to. He sat on the cot, elbows on knees, staring at his boots. His socks were wet. His fingers hurt. A thin line of dried blood had opened across one knuckle. Valor ate from a dented metal bowl near the door. After finishing, he nosed the empty food bag, then looked toward Nate's untouched pack of crackers on the shelf. Nate ignored him. Valor waited. Then, with the patience of an old soldier dealing with a stubborn recruit, the dog picked up the pack gently in his teeth, carried it across the room, and dropped it on Nate's boot. Nate stared at it. "Really?" Valor sat. "You're giving orders now?" The dog's tail moved once. Nate picked up the crackers and opened them. They tasted like cardboard and salt, but he ate every one. After that, Valor made it a habit. When Nate worked too long, Valor interrupted him. When Nate sat too still, Valor put his head beneath his hand. When nightmares took him somewhere else in the thin hours before dawn, Valor climbed halfway onto the cot and pressed his weight against Nate's ribs until the room returned. Concrete floor, furnace pipe, oil smell, snowlight at the window. No gunfire, no gate, no Marissa. Only the dog breathing beside him. On the 4th day, Lucas Bellamy called. Nate had left his name with a Veterans Support Office in Burlington, not expecting anything. The voice on the phone was young, tired, and trying hard not to sound overwhelmed. "Mr. Callahan? This is Lucas Bellamy with North Country Veterans Outreach. I got your intake request." Nate stood outside the garage under a pale sky, one hand tucked beneath his arm for warmth. "I didn't think anyone would call this fast." A pause. "I wish this counted as fast," Lucas said. That honesty made Nate listen. They met later that afternoon in the corner of the public library, because the outreach office in White Harbor existed only as a borrowed desk 2 days a month. Lucas arrived carrying a canvas messenger bag, his blonde hair flattened under a winter cap, his face open and earnest in a way that made him look younger than he probably was. He had the careful posture of someone who had learned to deliver bad news kindly. He shook Nate's hand and crouched briefly to let Valor sniff him. "Beautiful dog," Lucas said. "Retired working dog." Lucas nodded with immediate respect. "Then he probably has a better resume than both of us." Nate almost smiled. They sat at a small table near the history shelves. Lucas opened a folder, took out forms, and began making notes. Housing assistance was possible, but not immediate. Legal referrals existed, but there was a waiting list. Emergency funds required documentation Nate did not have with him. If there were concerns about financial abuse or improper use of power of attorney, Lucas could help connect him to the right office, but it would take time, and Nate would need copies of everything. Nate listened without interrupting. It was not that Lucas did not care. That was almost worse. The young man clearly cared. He underlined phone numbers, wrote names in the margins, explained which forms mattered most. He did everything a decent person inside a slow system could do. But outside the library window, snow kept falling. Nate thought of the house on Callahan Road. Warm lights, locked gate. His wife inside with another man. His parents gone somewhere he did not know. "I don't have time for a waiting list," he said. Lucas looked down at the forms, then back at him. "I know." The answer had no comfort in it, but it had truth. Before they left, Lucas slid a card across the table. "Call me anyway, even if it feels useless. Especially then." Nate put the card in his pocket. That night, Otis found him in the garage, tightening chains on a tow rig that did not need tightening. "You break that, you fix it twice," Otis said. Nate stepped back. Couldn't sleep. Otis leaned against the bay door, chewing a toothpick. For a while, he said nothing. Snowflakes moved through the light outside. Finally, he nodded toward the little room. "You got a roof tonight?" Nate wiped his hands on a rag. "It's not mine." "No roof is, once the snow gets heavy enough," Otis said. "You just keep it from falling on you." That was the closest thing to philosophy Nate had heard from him. He carried the words back to the room. Valor was already inside, lying beside Nate's wet boots. The dog lifted his head when Nate entered, then rested it again, as if satisfied that his human had returned to the right place. Nate sat on the cot. For a long while, he did not move. Outside the small window, snow fell through the yellow light above the alley, bright and steady. Beyond the garage, the town carried on. People locked doors that still opened for them. Families washed dishes. Couples argued. Furnaces hummed. Dogs slept on rugs in houses that had names. Nate looked at his hands. They were rougher than they had been a week ago. The knuckles were split. There was grease in the lines of his palms and salt dried white along his cuffs. The old tactical shirt beneath his flannel had frayed more at the wrist. His body ached in ordinary, humiliating ways. A man could survive a lot, he thought, and still be undone by being unseen. Valor shifted closer until his front paw rested gently across the toe of Nate's boot. Nate looked down. The gesture was so familiar now that it hurt. "I think I lost all of it," he said quietly. "The house, my folks, her, maybe even the version of me they remember." Valor's ears moved at the sound of his voice. Nate swallowed. "Maybe I came back too late." The dog lifted his head. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply looked at Nate with the patient certainty that had carried them through worse nights than this one. Not pity, not argument, just presence. Nate reached down and rested his hand on the dog's head, fingers sinking into the thick fur between his ears. For the first time all day, his breathing slowed. He still had no house, no answers, no money worth counting, no proof that would unlock the gate on Callahan Road. But he had this room for the night. He had work in the morning. And beside his wet boots, watching him through the quiet, he had one loyal soul who did not need paperwork, explanations, or a clean version of the past to know who he was. Nate turned off the lamp. The dark settled gently. Valor stayed awake a little longer, guarding the doorway while snow tapped softly against the glass. The storm left White Harbor shining. By morning, the town looked as if someone had washed it clean and set it under glass. Snow lay high along the curbs, rounded over fence posts, gathered on the church steps, and softened the roofs of the small wooden houses that climbed the hill above the lake. The sky had cleared to a thin winter blue. Sunlight struck the frozen surface of Lake Selby and broke into silver where the wind had swept the ice bare. Nate had been awake before dawn, not because he wanted to be. Sleep had slipped from him sometime around 4, leaving him staring at the underside of the cot in the small room behind Otis Bramwell's garage, listening to the furnace pipe knock and settle inside the wall. Valor had been asleep across the doorway, or pretending to be. Every time Nate shifted, one amber eye opened. By 7, Otis had already found him in the garage. "Church needs help moving boxes," the old mechanic said, tossing a set of keys onto the workbench. "Community center's short 2 volunteers. Roads are ugly near the lake. Take the blue pickup." Nate looked at him. "You asking or assigning?" Otis shoved a toothpick into the corner of his mouth. "Pays 20 an hour and a bowl of stew if the church ladies like your face." "They won't." "They might like the dog." Valor, sitting beside Nate's boot, gave Otis a calm look that suggested this was likely. So Nate went. The First Congregational Church stood near the center of town, a white clapboard building with green shutters and a steeple that had survived more winters than most of the people praying beneath it. Volunteers had formed a loose line from the basement door to the back of the pickup. Boxes moved hand to hand. Canned soup, blankets, prescription bags sealed in plastic, bags of dry dog food, small bundles of split wood wrapped with twine. No one made a speech about helping neighbors. They were too busy lifting. That suited Nate. He worked quietly, his old tactical shirt hidden beneath a gray flannel and canvas jacket, combat pants tucked into snow-crusted boots. His hands found the rhythm easily. Lift, turn, step, set down, repeat. Labor was simpler than conversation. A box did not care what stories had been told about him. It only had weight. A woman with a red scarf and a clipboard asked his name. "Nate," he said. "Callahan?" He paused. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes flicked to Valor, then back to him. Not unkindly, but with recognition. White Harbor had too many windows and not enough secrets. "We appreciate the help," she said. He nodded once and went back to the boxes. By noon, the supplies had been delivered to the community center, a low brick building near the old ferry road. The place smelled of coffee, wet wool, and cardboard. People came and went with lists in their hands. A few older residents sat in folding chairs near the heater, waiting for rides. Someone had put a pot of stew on a long table beside stacks of paper cups. Nate ate standing up near the door. Valor sat at his side, accepting a piece of plain bread from a woman who asked permission first and smiled when the dog took it gently. "You two heading back to Bramwell's?" one of the volunteers asked. "After I dropped the last load." The last load was small. 3 bags of medication and groceries, 2 folded blankets, and a box of canned goods that had been set aside for delivery to houses along the lakeside road. The volunteer with the clipboard hesitated when Nate picked them up. "Those were supposed to go out with Elena," she said, looking toward the front windows. "Elena?" "Elena Whitcomb. She usually handles the lake route, but she must have already left with part of it." The woman glanced at the road where sunlight flashed hard on the plowed snow. "Stubborn woman. She never waits when she thinks someone needs something." Nate did not ask more. It was not his place. He loaded the remaining supplies into Otis's blue pickup and headed toward the lake. The road curved away from town, past shuttered summer cottages and bare birch trees whose branches shone with ice. The lake ran alongside the road in broken glimpses between trunks, wide and silent under its winter skin. Snowbanks rose higher here, thrown up by plows, their edges cut clean as walls. The tires hummed over packed snow. Valor stood with his front paws braced against the floorboard, head lifted, nose working. "You smell stew or trouble?" Nate asked. Valor did not look at him. Nate slowed near the first mailbox and delivered a bag to a small yellow house where an elderly man waved from behind the glass. At the second stop, he left canned goods in a covered bin by the porch, as instructed. At the third, no one answered, but smoke rose from the chimney, and the note on the list said to place the medication inside the storm door. The simple usefulness of the work settled Nate in a way he had not expected. No one asked him to explain himself. No one asked where he had been or why his name no longer belonged on Callahan Road. He knocked, lifted, carried, and left things where they needed to go. For an hour, his life narrowed to tasks that made sense. Then Valor made a sound. Not a bark, not a growl. A low, strained whine from deep in his chest. Nate glanced over. "What is it?" The dog's body had gone rigid. His eyes were fixed ahead, ears high, muzzle angled toward the right side of the road. Nate followed his line of sight and saw nothing at first. Only snowbanks, a thin stand of trees, and the shoulder where plowed snow had hardened into uneven ridges. Valor whined again, sharper this time. Nate eased off the gas. Around the next bend, he saw the truck. It was a small white utility vehicle, half pulled onto the shoulder, its rear end too close to the road. Hazard lights blinked weakly under a crust of snow. The driver's door stood open. Nate's hands tightened on the wheel. He stopped behind it and put Otis's truck in park. "Stay." Valor did not stay. The command had barely left Nate's mouth before the German shepherd moved, not wildly, but with purpose. He slipped out as soon as Nate opened the door and went around the utility truck, nose low, paws quick over the packed snow. Nate followed. At first he saw the grocery bag. It lay on its side near the rear tire, oranges spilled across the snow like small bright lamps. A paper pharmacy sack had torn open, plastic prescription bottles scattered beside it. Then he saw a woman's hand, half buried in white. She was lying between the truck and the snowbank, partly shielded from the road. Her coat was deep blue, dusted with powder. One arm was curled beneath her. The other hand still clutched the handle of a canvas bag. Nate dropped to his knees. "Ma'am?" No response. He brushed snow from her face. She was in her 40s, maybe mid-40s, with pale skin flushed unevenly from cold, dark lashes resting against her cheeks, and chestnut hair loosened from a low tie at the back of her neck. Her lips had gone faintly blue. Nate pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse. Weak, but there. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Nothing. Valor stood close, but not crowding. His nose moved near her sleeve, then her face. He gave one quiet huff, then looked at Nate. "I know." Nate pulled off one glove and checked her breathing more carefully. No obvious bleeding, no sign of impact trauma. She was cold, exhausted, possibly hypothermic. He looked toward the open truck door. The front seat held more supplies, a thermos, a folded delivery list, and a phone lying face down on the floor mat. He took his coat off and covered her as best he could. "Ma'am, I'm going to move you." Her eyelids fluttered. Nate leaned closer. "That's it. Stay with me." Her eyes opened halfway. They were brown, unfocused at first, then suddenly aware. She looked at him, then past him to Valor. Her hand moved weakly in the air. Nate froze. The movement was not random. Her fingers shaped something, then shifted, then tried again. "I don't understand," he said. She tried to sit up and failed. Her breathing quickened, fear entering her face. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of not being understood. Nate held his hands up, palms open. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at his mouth, not his eyes. That was when he understood. "You can't hear me," he said, more to himself than to her. Her eyes flicked to his lips, then she made another sign with trembling fingers. Nate did not know what it meant. For one helpless second, the old frustration rose in him. Not anger at her, anger at himself. He had been trained to read terrain, weapons, panic, blood loss, bad roads, bad rooms, bad men. But here, in broad daylight on a quiet lakeside road, a woman was trying to tell him something with her hands, and he had nothing to give back except a voice she could not hear. Valor solved what Nate could not. The dog lowered himself slowly into the snow beside her, not touching at first. He made his body small, calm, unthreatening. The woman's gaze shifted to him. Her hand stopped shaking as much. Valor rested his head near her elbow, close enough for warmth, far enough to ask permission. The woman looked at Nate again. This time she pointed weakly toward the cab of her truck, then tapped 2 fingers against her wrist. Phone. Nate moved fast. He found the phone on the floor mat. The screen was cracked at one corner but working. No lock screen password, only a medical ID notification and several missed calls from Mabel. He opened the emergency panel first. Name: Elena Whitcomb. Death. Allergies listed. Emergency contact: Mabel Cross. He called 911, then Mabel. While the dispatcher asked questions, Nate loaded Elena carefully into Otis's truck because the cab was warmer and the responders were 15 minutes out. He kept his movements slow and visible. Every time he touched her shoulder or arm, he made sure she saw his hand first. Valor climbed in after her and settled on the floorboard, his body pressed against the seat, lending heat without crowding. Elena watched him through half-closed eyes. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics knew her. "Elena?" one of them called, then caught himself and moved into her line of sight. He was a stocky man with kind eyes and a silver cross pinned to his jacket. He signed something simple with practiced hands. Elena answered faintly. Nate stepped back. For reasons he did not like, relief came with shame. Relief that someone else knew how to speak to her. Shame that he had not. The paramedic looked at Nate. "You found her?" Valor did. The man glanced at the dog, who sat beside the truck like a disciplined shadow. "Good dog." Nate nodded. "Yes, he is." They took Elena to the small clinic attached to the community health center. Nate followed in Otis's pickup because her truck had to be left on the shoulder for a tow. He told himself he was going to make sure her keys and supplies got back to the right people. That was all. It was not all. At the clinic, a nurse wrapped Elena in heated blankets while the paramedic explained that she was severely chilled, dehydrated, and overworked, but likely going to be fine. She had been delivering medication and groceries after the storm, ignored several calls telling her to wait, and apparently tried to finish the route alone. "Sounds familiar," Nate said quietly. The nurse glanced at him. "Stubborn people are a local resource," she said. Elena woke more fully an hour later. Nate was sitting near the door, Valor lying at his feet. He had planned to leave twice. Each time, Valor had remained where he was, chin on his paws, as if the matter had not yet concluded. Elena turned her head. Her eyes found Valor first. The dog lifted his head. Elena raised one hand from beneath the blanket and made a small, deliberate motion. 2 fingers down, palm soft. Valor stood, took one step closer, and sat. Nate stared. Elena's mouth curved slightly. She made another sign. Nate did not understand it, but Valor watched her hand with complete attention, then lowered his head onto the edge of the mattress. The smile grew. No sound came from her, but the room changed anyway. Nate felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was held tight. The nurse came in with a notepad and pen, but Elena reached for her own small notebook from the bag someone had brought in from her truck. Its cover was pale blue fabric, worn at the corners. Her fingers moved with more steadiness now. She wrote, then turned the page toward Nate. "Your dog listens better than most people." Nate read it once, then again. A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. It was not big, not bright enough to fill the room, but it was real. And because it was real, it startled him. Valor's ears twitched at the sound. "I won't argue with that," Nate said. Elena watched his mouth, then looked at the nurse, who repeated the words while signing loosely. Elena's eyes warmed with amusement. The nurse helped interpret for a few minutes. Elena Whitcomb, Nate learned, was 46, lived above her restoration studio near the square, and taught basic American Sign Language classes at the community center twice a week. She restored old paintings, damaged family portraits, cracked frames, things people thought were too ruined to matter. The lake route had been hers for years. She knew who needed low-sodium soup, who pretended not to need help, who would forget medicine unless it was placed directly in their hands. Nate listened, surprised by how complete a life could appear in a few details. Elena was not fragile. That became clear quickly. Exhausted, yes. Cold, yes. Irritated at herself, definitely. But not helpless. When the nurse scolded her for going alone after a storm, Elena answered with quick, sharp signs that made the nurse roll her eyes. "She says people were waiting," the nurse translated. "They could have waited longer than you could lie in the snow," Nate said. Elena read his lips slowly. Her eyebrow lifted. The nurse signed. Elena took the notebook and wrote, "Says the man who looks like he has ignored every sensible warning ever given to him." Nate looked down at his old boots, his cracked hands, the military shirt frayed at the cuffs. Fair. Elena's silent laugh showed mostly in her eyes. Before he left, she asked about Valor. Not about his service record in the official way people sometimes did, not with curiosity sharpened by violence. She pointed to the dog, then to Nate, then placed one hand over her chest and tilted her head. The nurse hesitated. "She's asking if he keeps you steady." Nate did not answer immediately. Valor looked up at him. There were easy answers. Companion, retired K9, partner, dog. None of them were wrong. None were enough. "Yes," Nate said finally. "He does." Elena nodded as if she had already known. Then she looked at Valor and made a slow sign, touching her fingers to her chin and moving them outward. The dog's head tilted. Nate frowned. "What was that?" The nurse smiled. "Thank you." Elena motioned for Nate to try. He shook his head once. "Don't mess it up." She motioned again, firmer this time. There was no pity in her expression, no softness that excused him from trying, just expectation. Nate lifted his hand awkwardly, touched his fingers somewhere near his mouth, then moved them outward too stiffly. Elena winced in a way that needed no translation. The nurse laughed. Valor, watching Elena rather than Nate, gave one soft huff and lowered his head as if he had understood the lesson better than the man. "Traitor," Nate muttered. Elena corrected the movement, slower this time. Nate tried again. Badly, but less badly. She gave him a small, approving nod. It should not have mattered. It was one sign, one tiny bridge over a space he had not known how to cross an hour earlier. But as Nate stood there in the warm clinic room, with snowlight pressed against the windows and Valor calm beside the bed, he felt something he had not felt since turning away from the locked gate. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too large, too dangerous. This was smaller. The feeling that, for one moment, he had been useful without being feared. When he left the clinic, the sun had begun to lower over the lake. The snow outside glowed blue in the shadows, and gold where the last light touched it. Valor walked beside him, close but easy. Nate paused at the curb and looked back through the clinic window. Elena was sitting up now, wrapped in blankets, writing something in her blue notebook while the nurse fussed around her. She looked tired, annoyed, alive. Valor bumped Nate's hand with his nose. "I know," Nate said. He looked down at the dog, then at his own hand. Slowly, feeling foolish though no one was watching, he practiced the sign again. "Thank you." This time it almost looked right. For the first time since coming home, the winter did not feel like something closing around him. It felt like something bright enough to see by. Elena did not invite Nate to the studio the next day. She waited 3. That told him something about her before he understood anything else. She was not the kind of person who mistook gratitude for a debt or rescue for ownership. She did not send a dramatic message. She did not ask if he was all right in a tone that made the question feel like a diagnosis. The note came through Lucas Bellamy, of all people, because Lucas had stopped by the garage with another form Nate needed to sign. "Elena Whitcomb asked me to give you this," Lucas said, handing over a folded piece of pale blue paper. Nate looked at it, but did not open it right away. Lucas raised both hands. "I didn't read it." Otis, passing behind them with a socket wrench, snorted. "Boy looks too honest to read other folks' mail. That'll hurt him someday." Lucas smiled awkwardly and left. Nate unfolded the note after the garage door rolled shut behind him. The handwriting was clean and compact. "If you are willing, I could use help repairing 2 shelves damaged during the storm. Payment, cash, coffee, and the chance for Valor to prove again that he is the smartest one in the room." Below that was an address on the town square. Nate read it twice. Valor sat beside the workbench, watching his face. "She invited you, not me," Nate said. The dog's tail moved once against the concrete. "Fine," Nate muttered. "Us." The building stood at the corner of Main and Alder, a narrow brick structure with tall windows on the 2nd floor and a small diner below. Its sign read "Mabel's Table" in red letters faded by years of sun and snow. Warm air breathed out every time the diner door opened, carrying the smell of coffee, butter, fried onions, and something sweet enough to make Valor's nose lift. Nate took the outside stairs to the 2nd floor. Halfway up, he paused, not from exhaustion. The stairs were simple, swept clean, lined by a railing wrapped in old white lights that had probably stayed up past Christmas because nobody had the heart to take them down. He paused, because he realized he had not been invited into anyone's private space since coming home. Not truly. The garage room was shelter. The clinic had been necessity. This was different. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Elena stood on the other side wearing a soft gray sweater under a canvas apron marked with faint smears of ochre, blue, and white. Her chestnut hair was tied low at the back of her neck, though a few loose strands had escaped near her temples. She looked steadier than she had at the clinic. Color returned to her face, eyes clear and direct. She smiled first at Valor, then at Nate. She pointed to him, then to the dog, then stepped aside. Nate entered carefully, the way he still entered unfamiliar rooms, though he tried not to make it obvious. The studio stopped him. It was not large, but it felt deeper than its walls. Winter light poured through the tall front windows and lay across work tables, wooden frames, jars of brushes, folded cloths, bottles with handwritten labels, and paintings in various states of injury and repair. Some leaned against the brick wall with torn corners, some lay flat beneath thin paper. A large landscape of a snowy field rested on an easel near the window, half cleaned, one side still browned by age, the other side opening into pale blue sky. The air smelled of linseed oil, paper, old wood, and tea. After days of grease, salt, and cold concrete, The quiet order of the room felt almost unreal. Elena closed the door behind him and picked up the pale blue notebook he had seen at the clinic. She wrote quickly, then turned it around. "Thank you for coming. I promise not to faint today." Nate read it and looked at her. "I appreciate the warning." She watched his mouth carefully, then smiled. She tapped the notebook again and wrote beneath the first line, "You may speak normally. I read lips when people face me. But if you mumble, I will blame you, not my ears." Nate almost apologized, then stopped himself. Instead, he nodded. "Fair." Valor had already begun inspecting the room, not nosing into things, not disturbing anything, just mapping the space. He sniffed near a stack of frames, glanced at the window, checked the corner by the small stove, then came back to stand beside Nate. Elena noticed the pattern. Her expression softened. She pointed at Valor, then moved her hand flat through the air in a slow, deliberate gesture. The dog sat. Nate stared. Elena's eyebrows lifted with mild satisfaction. "You practiced," Nate said. She wrote, "He understands confidence better than vocabulary." "That may apply to both of us." She read his lips, thought for a moment, then laughed silently through her eyes. The damaged shelves were in the back room, where storm water had leaked through an old window frame and warped two supports. Nate removed his jacket, rolled his sleeves, and got to work. The job was simple. Brace the shelf, replace split screws, sand the swollen edge, reset the brackets. Simple things were a mercy. Wood told the truth in ways people often did not. A crack showed where pressure had gone. A warped board revealed what it had endured. Elena worked nearby at a table, cleaning a small portrait with a brush so fine it looked like a single hair. From time to time, Nate found himself watching her hands. They moved with precision, but not haste. Every motion had patience inside it. She did not attack the damage. She coaxed the original surface back into view. Dirt came away in small, yellowed traces. A cheek appeared, then the curve of a collar, then the soft brown of an eye that had been hidden beneath decades of smoke and varnish. Nate tightened a screw and looked away. He did not want the thought that came to him, that some things could look ruined only because nobody had taken the time to uncover what was still there. A knock sounded below, followed by the heavy step of someone climbing the stairs without waiting for an answer. Elena looked toward the door with a resigned fondness. It swung open, and a woman came in carrying a tray, as if entering rooms uninvited was not a habit but a public service. She was round, short, and bright-cheeked, with cropped silver curls and a red sweater under a white apron. A checkered towel hung over one arm. She smelled faintly of soup and cinnamon. "So this is him," the woman announced, then looked at Valor. "And this is obviously the better-looking one." Nate straightened. Elena touched 2 fingers to her chin and moved them outward, then pointed to the woman. The woman waved a hand. Yes, thank you, I know. I'm generous and beloved." Elena rolled her eyes. The woman set the tray down on a cleared corner of the table. "Mabel Cross. I run the diner downstairs, feed half this town, and know the other half's business against my will." "Nate Callahan," he said. "I know who you are." Mabel said it without hesitation, then softened the words by pushing a bowl toward him. "Chicken soup. Don't argue. Men who look like old fence posts need soup." Nate glanced at Elena. Elena wrote in her notebook and held it up. "She bullies everyone with food. It means she likes you." Mabel leaned over to read it and sniffed. "I do not bully. I nourish aggressively." Valor sat very straight beside the tray. Mabel looked down at him. "You too, soldier, but no onions." She produced a small container of plain chicken like she had prepared for the possibility. Valor accepted with solemn gratitude. For the first time in days, Nate ate sitting at a table with other people nearby and did not feel watched like a problem. Mabel talked enough for all 3 of them. She told Nate which streets iced over first, which church volunteer mislabeled sugar as salt last winter, which tourists drove too fast near the lake, and which town councilman liked to pretend he shoveled his own walkway when everyone knew his wife did it. Elena followed the conversation easily when Mabel faced her, and when she did not, Elena threw a balled napkin that hit Mabel's shoulder with perfect aim. "Fine, fine," Mabel said, turning her whole body. "I'm looking at you." Nate noticed how natural it was between them. No pity, no exaggerated care, just long practice, affection, and irritation. The kind that meant family, whether blood had anything to do with it or not. After Mabel left, the studio grew quiet again, but not empty. Nate returned to the shelf. Elena returned to the portrait. Valor settled near the stove, where sunlight warmed one side of his coat. An hour passed that way. Then Elena came to stand beside Nate while he tested the repaired board with his hand. She examined the bracket, nodded approvingly, and wrote, "You repair things like you expect them to be used again." Nate read the sentence. Something about it landed too close. "That's the point, isn't it?" She studied him for a moment. Then she wrote, "Some people only repair things enough to sell them." Nate did not answer. The words made him think of Graham Voss's clean boots at the gate, of the new plaque on the mailbox, of his father's workshop, probably cleared out or photographed for some future brochure. Lakefront character, original craftsmanship, historic charm. Words people used when they wanted to profit from a place without loving it. Elena watched his face change. She did not ask at once. That was another thing Nate noticed. She gave silence room to decide what it wanted to become. Finally, he said, "My family had a wood shop behind the house." Elena leaned back against the work table, giving him her full attention. "My grandfather started it. My dad kept it going. Small stuff, mostly. Frames, cabinets, repairs, doors for people who didn't want new ones." Nate ran his thumb along the edge of the shelf he had just fixed. "I hated sanding when I was a kid." Elena smiled faintly. "I'd give a lot to sand something in there now." The quiet after that was different, not awkward, acknowledging. Elena went to the kettle and poured tea into 2 mismatched mugs. She handed one to Nate, then tapped her notebook with the pen. "You said at the clinic that valor keeps you steady." Nate read it. "He does." "What keeps him steady?" The question surprised him. Nate looked toward Valor. The dog was awake, of course, always aware enough to know when he had become the subject of a room. "Work," Nate said. "Routine. Knowing where I am." He paused. "Knowing where I am supposed to be." Elena looked from Valor to Nate. "And you?" Nate almost gave an easy answer. He had several. Coffee, a cot, day labor, forms, the next task, the next hour. Instead, he set the mug down. "I don't know anymore." Elena did not move. Nate regretted the honesty immediately, but it had already entered the room. He looked toward the window. Below, people crossed the square with shoulders hunched against the cold. A man helped an older woman over a snowbank. A truck rolled past with a plow blade lifted. The town continued in its ordinary way, full of people who knew where to go at the end of the day. "I came back thinking my family would be there," he said. "My wife, my parents, the house. Stupid maybe, but I built a lot of years around that picture." Elena's pen hovered above the page. "I don't even know where my parents are." His voice stayed low. "Marissa said they left because they couldn't watch what I was becoming." Elena looked up sharply. Nate saw the reaction and gave a humorless breath. "That's the clean version." She wrote something,
stopped, crossed it out, then wrote again. "Do you believe her?" Nate stared at the words. There were questions a man could answer quickly, because the answer cost nothing. This one cost too much. "I don't know," he said. Elena's gaze did not soften into pity. That helped. "I missed calls," he admitted. "There were months I didn't answer letters, not because I didn't care, because I couldn't make myself sound normal, and I thought silence was better than frightening them." He looked down at his hands. The cuts across his knuckles had begun to close, dark lines beneath the skin. Maybe silence taught them to live without me. Elena put the pen down. For a moment, she only watched him. Then she reached to the work table and picked up the damaged portrait she had been cleaning. She turned it so he could see. The painting showed an older woman in a dark dress. Half the face was clear now. The other half remained under old varnish, yellowed and dull. Elena pointed to the damaged side, then to the clean side. Then she wrote, "If you only saw this half, would you think the other half was gone?" Nate looked at the portrait. "No." She wrote, "Hidden is not gone." The sentence was simple. It should have been too simple to matter, but Nate felt it move through him quietly, finding the place where Marissa's words had been sitting for days like ice. Hidden is not gone. Valor rose from the stove and came to Nate without being called. He placed one paw on the toe of Nate's boot, then leaned his head against his thigh. Elena noticed the gesture. Her expression changed, not into surprise, but recognition, as if she had just understood that this was not a trick the dog had learned. It was a language. Nate rested his hand on Valor's head. For once, he did not apologize for needing the support. Later, Elena asked to see the papers. Not all of them. Not as an official thing. She made that clear with 3 separate notes because she seemed to understand how quickly help could feel like invasion to him. Nate brought the folder in from the truck. It was thin. Too thin for a life. Copies of the limited power of attorney, a few old tax documents, a bank notice he did not fully understand, 2 letters from Marissa that said almost nothing in careful language, a copy of a transfer summary with signatures blurred by scanning. Elena cleared a table and laid each page flat with the care she gave paintings. Nate watched her work. She did not read fast. She read closely. She checked dates against corners, compared signatures, tilted pages toward the light, studied where scans had darkened or faded. Once, she took out a small magnifying lens from a drawer and examined the edge of a copied page. "I'm not asking you to be a lawyer," Nate said. Elena did not look up. She wrote with her left hand while keeping one finger on a line of text. "Good. I am not one." Then, after a pause, she added, "But damaged paper has habits." He waited. She pointed to the signature on one page, then another. Nate leaned in. At first he saw only his own name, or something close enough to it to make his stomach tighten. Elena placed a ruler beneath the dates. One document had been notarized 3 weeks after he remembered signing the original authorization. Another page referred to an attachment that was not included in the folder. The scan around one signature was darker than the rest of the page, as if copied from a different source. None of it proved fraud. None of it opened the gate on Callahan Road. But it did something almost as important. It disturbed the certainty. Elena wrote, "This may be nothing." Then beneath it, "But it is not clean." Nate read the sentence again. Not clean. He closed his eyes briefly. For days, the world had been asking him to accept Marissa's version because she had spoken it calmly, and because documents apparently existed somewhere behind her words. Now, on a restoration table above a diner, beside jars of brushes and a half-cleaned portrait, someone had looked at the paper and said the thing he had been afraid to trust in himself. Something was wrong.
When he opened his eyes, Elena was watching him. He said, "I thought maybe I was remembering it wrong." She shook her head once, not dramatically, not with certainty she had not earned. Just no. The studio had grown darker without them noticing. The winter sun had dropped behind the square, and the windows reflected the room back at them. Nate standing over the table, Elena beside him with her pen in hand, Valor at their feet like a quiet witness. Elena gathered the pages carefully and placed them back into the folder. Then she wrote one last note and turned it toward him. Maybe someone was waiting for you. Maybe the message never reached the right door. Nate stared at it. Outside, the lights along the square came on one by one. He thought of his mother's handwriting, though he had not seen it in years. He thought of his father's hands, rough with sawdust. He thought of returned calls he had never made and letters he had been too ashamed to answer. And for the first time, the question changed. Not why had they left, but what if they had tried not to? Nate folded the note and slipped it into the front of the folder without asking if he could keep it. Elena saw him do it. She did not stop him. When he and Valor stepped back into the cold, Mabel's diner glowed below them, full of voices, dishes, and warm yellow light. Snow had begun falling again, but softly now, without threat. Nate stood on the landing for a moment before going down. Behind him, in the studio, damaged paintings waited under careful hands. In his own hands, he carried a folder that had not become proof yet. But it had become something. A beginning. The box did not look important. That was why Nate almost threw it away. It sat on the lowest shelf in the back storage room of Otis Bramwell's garage, half hidden behind a stack of cracked hubcaps and an old snowblower that had not run since before anyone admitted it was dead. The cardboard had softened at the corners from years of damp air. Someone had written MISC, mail/front office, across the top in black marker, then crossed it out so many times the words looked like a warning. Nate found it on a Friday morning while helping Otis clear space for a used transmission. "Keep, toss, or pretend we never saw it?" Otis asked from the doorway. Nate wiped dust from the lid. "What is it?" "Stuff the post office dropped here after they changed the route years back. Wrong deliveries, old notices, things folks never picked up." Otis shrugged, but there was something in the way he avoided looking at the box too closely. "Mostly junk." Elena, who had come by to return Nate's folder of documents after making copies of the suspicious pages, stood near the workbench with her pale blue notebook tucked against her chest. Valor sat beside her, watching Otis move tools with the patient suspicion of a dog who believed every loud object deserved supervision. Nate lifted the lid. The smell of old paper rose into the cold room. At first he saw nothing but envelopes, yellowed flyers, a few misdelivered bills, and folded notices sealed in plastic. Then he saw his name. Not Callahan Road, not Voss Property Management. His name. Nathaniel Callahan. The handwriting on the envelope made his hand stop before he touched it. He knew that slant, the careful loops, the way the capital N leaned forward, as if eager to arrive before the rest of the word. His mother's handwriting. The garage around him seemed to lose sound. Otis said something, but Nate did not hear it. He took the envelope out slowly. It had been stamped, forwarded, marked, and returned. Red ink cut across the front, "Return to sender." Below that, in another stamp, "No longer at this address." Nate stared at the words. Elena stepped closer, her expression changing as she read the envelope. She did not reach for it. She only stood still enough to give the moment room. Nate pulled out another letter, then another. Then a whole bundled stack tied with an old rubber band that had dried and cracked. All addressed to him. Some were from June Callahan, some from Walter and June together. A few had his father's harder, shakier handwriting, block letters pressed deep into the paper. The dates ran across years. Before Nate's final deployment, during it, after it, and then through the months when Marissa had told him his parents were gone because they could no longer bear what he had become. Valor stood. The dog did not bark. He crossed the room and pressed his shoulder lightly against Nate's leg. Nate opened the first letter with care that felt almost ceremonial. Dear Nate, your father says I should stop worrying because soldiers are busy men, but mothers are not built that way. If this reaches you late, forgive me. I keep thinking of you when the lake freezes. You always said the ice sounded alive at night. He read until the words blurred. He sat down on an overturned crate before his knees could make the decision for him. Elena moved quietly. She pulled another crate closer and sat across from him. Otis, after one long look, took off his cap and ran a hand over his gray hair. I didn't know those were in there, the old mechanic said, voice rougher than usual. Nate nodded, though he had no idea what he was agreeing to. He opened another. Nathaniel, your mother says I write like I'm filling out a repair order, so here it is plain. I miss you. Come home when you can. The north porch is sagging again, and I'm too old to pretend I don't need help. Walter. That was all. 5 lines. Nate pressed his thumb against the bottom of the page where the ink had faded slightly. His father had never wasted words. If he wrote, I miss you, it meant something had cracked open in him. There were more. June asking why he had not answered. June saying Marissa had explained that Nate needed quiet. June saying they would respect his wishes if seeing them made things harder. Walter apologizing if he had ever made Nate feel he had to return as the same man who left. A letter written in a trembling hand, months later. Son, Marissa says you signed the papers so she can handle everything. She says it is for the best. Your mother cried when we packed the blue curtains. I told her houses are just wood. I lied. Nate read that one twice. Then he folded it very carefully and placed it on his knee. The air in the garage seemed too cold to breathe. Elena's eyes were bright, but she did not cry for him. He was grateful for that. If she had cried, he might have broken in a way he was not ready to do in front of Otis and old tires and tools. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote slowly. They were writing to you. Nate looked at the words. For days, a poison had lived in him, quiet and persistent. They left because of you. They left because you became too damaged to love. They left because even parents could reach the end of waiting. The letters did not fix everything. They did not erase his missed calls, his months of silence, the hard truth that he had not always known how to be reached. But they changed the shape of the wound. His parents had not simply turned away. Someone had stood between them. He looked toward Otis. Why would these come here? Otis's mouth tightened. He leaned against the shelf, cap in both hands now. After your place changed hands, mail started getting rerouted wrong for a while. Post office was short-staffed. Some stuff came through the garage because we used to get parts deliveries under the same rural carrier. He looked at the box. I told them to sort it. Guess nobody did. Or somebody didn't want it sorted, Nate said. Otis did not answer. He did not have to. Elena pointed gently to the return address on one envelope. New Hampshire. Nate saw it then, written in his mother's hand, a small town outside Concord. An address he did not know. A place his parents had gone without him. His fingers tightened around the letter. Elena wrote, Call. One word. Not a suggestion, not a comfort. A door. Nate stared at the return address. His chest felt too full and too hollow at once. What if they don't answer? Elena held his gaze. Then she wrote, Then you call again. Otis coughed and turned away, pretending to inspect the dead snowblower. Nate took out his phone.
His hand was steady when he dialed the first number he found in one of the later letters. It had been written below the return address in June's careful script, as if she had wanted to give him every possible path home. The call rang 6 times. Then a machine answered. A woman's recorded voice, older but unmistakable. "Hello, you've reached Walter and June. Leave a message. If this is Nate, honey, please try the other number I wrote down." Nate closed his eyes. The room tilted. Not from weakness, from hearing his mother say his name as if she had never stopped expecting him. He ended the call before the beep because he could not speak. Elena waited. Valor's paw came down gently on the toe of his boot. Nate opened the next letter and found the other number. This time someone answered on the 4th ring. "Hello?" The voice was female, but not his mother's. Younger. Cautious. Nate swallowed. "This is Nathaniel Callahan. I'm trying to reach Walter and June Callahan?" Silence. Then the woman inhaled sharply. "Oh my God." Nate stood without realizing he had moved. "Who is this?" "My name is Ruth Bell. June is my aunt. Wait, please, wait." There was noise on the line, a chair scraping, a hand over the receiver, a voice calling through a house. Then, faintly, far away and trembling, "Nate?" The sound struck him harder than any accusation. He gripped the edge of the workbench. "Mom?" The word left him broken. On the other end of the line, June Callahan began to cry. Not loudly. June had never been loud with grief. It came through the phone in small, breathless sounds that made Nate feel 8 years old and 52 all at once. "I wrote," she said. "I wrote so many times." "I know," Nate said, looking at the open box. "I just found them." "She told us you didn't want us coming. She said the doctors—" June stopped, breath catching. "She said you needed distance from everything that reminded you of home." Nate could not answer, because some part of him had believed that might be true. Not because he wanted distance, but because shame often disguised itself as mercy. A different sound came through the line then. A man's voice, thick and strained. "June, give it here." There was a rustle. Then Walter Callahan came on the phone. He did not say hello. He said, "Son." One word. Nate bent forward as if the word had weight. "Dad." Walter's breathing was uneven. When he spoke again, each word seemed to require effort, but the stubbornness in him remained intact. "You alive?" Nate let out something between a laugh and a sob. "Yeah." "Good." A pause. Then Walter said, "Come see your mother." "I will." "No." His father's voice roughened. "We'll come there." Nate looked at Elena. She had understood enough from his face. Her hand had risen to her mouth. "You don't have to." Walter cut him off with the old authority Nate remembered from childhood. "Don't tell me what I have to do in my own family." For the first time in a very long while, Nate heard his father inside that damaged voice, and he obeyed. By the following afternoon, Mabel had turned one corner of her diner into something like a family room without asking permission from anyone involved. She pushed 2 tables together near the front window. She put a pot of coffee there, then tea, then biscuits, then soup, then told Nate to stop pacing because he was wearing a trench in her floor. "I'm not pacing," Nate said. Elena, seated near the window with Valor at her feet, looked down at his boots, then back at him. Mabel pointed. "Even the dog thinks you're pacing." Valor did, in fact, look tired of watching him move. Outside, the snow had stopped. Afternoon sunlight lay clean across the square, bright on the shoveled sidewalks and the red sign over Mabel's table. Cars passed slowly. Every time one turned toward the diner, Nate's body tightened. When the gray sedan finally stopped at the curb, he knew before the door opened.
June got out first. She was smaller than his memory had allowed. 73, wrapped in a beige winter coat, a pale knitted scarf at her throat, silver blonde hair pinned low beneath a wool hat. In one hand she held an old folded scarf, blue and white, the one Nate had worn as a boy until he outgrew it, and June kept it because mothers kept useless things on purpose. She looked through the diner window, saw him, and stopped. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Then Nate opened the door. Cold air swept in. The bell above the diner rang once, too bright and ordinary for the moment it was announcing. "Mom," he said. June stepped inside with both hands pressed to her mouth. Her eyes moved over his face, searching for the boy and the man and all the missing years between them. Then she reached him. She touched his jaw first, as if confirming he was not a photograph. "My Nathaniel," she whispered. He folded around her carefully, afraid of crushing her, afraid she might vanish if he held on too hard. But June held him with surprising strength. Her small hands gripped the back of his jacket, her face pressed against his chest. "I thought you didn't want us," she said. Nate closed his eyes. "I thought you left. I tried to find you. I know. I never stopped. I know now." Behind her, Walter entered with Ruth Bell supporting one arm. He had aged beyond what Nate expected, and exactly as much as he feared. His hair was white, his shoulders still broad under a dark wool coat, but one side of his body moved slower than the other. His right hand curled slightly from the stroke. His face had more lines, deeper grooves, yet his gray-blue eyes were Nate's own, or Nate's were his. Walter stopped just inside the door. Father and son looked at each other across the warm diner air. There were too many apologies for speech, too many explanations. Too much time lost because other people had learned how to use silence as a wall. Walter lifted his good arm. That was all. Nate crossed the room and embraced him. His father's arm came around his back with a force that belonged to an earlier man. Walter's chin pressed hard against Nate's shoulder. For a moment, the old man shook, not from weakness, but from the effort of holding himself together and failing. "You came back," Walter said. Nate's voice broke. "I came back. You were supposed to come to the porch." "I tried." Walter nodded against him. "I know that now." Those words undid something in Nate. He had held himself together at the gate, in the garage, in the library, in the studio, through hunger, cold, rumor, and paperwork. But his father saying, "I know that now," broke the final lock. Nate wept, not loudly, not theatrically. He simply bowed his head against his father's shoulder and let the grief move through him like thaw water under ice. June held both of them, one hand on Nate's back, the other on Walter's arm. The diner went very quiet. Mabel turned away and wiped the counter with unnecessary violence. Elena lowered her gaze, giving them privacy even while staying near enough to witness. Ruth Bell stood by the door, crying openly into a tissue. Valor approached last. The German shepherd moved with solemn care through the small space between tables. He sniffed June's coat first. She looked down, tears still on her cheeks. "Oh," she whispered. "Valor." At the sound of his name, the dog's ears lifted. June covered her mouth again. "You wrote about him." Nate looked at her. "You remember?" "I remembered every word I got." Valor turned then toward Walter. The old man looked down at the dog, and something in his face softened into recognition, not of Valor personally, but of what the dog represented. Years of Nate's letters. A partner he had never met. Proof that his son had not been alone in all the places parents could not follow. Walter lowered himself slowly into a chair. Valor stepped closer and placed his head on Walter's knee. Walter's weakened hand trembled as it came down. His fingers moved clumsily through the thick fur between the dog's ears. He tried to speak, failed, swallowed, and tried again. "Good," he said. Valor did not move. Walter breathed out. "Good dog." Nate watched them and understood that some reunions needed more than human language. His father, who had lost some command of his own words, and the old K9, who had never needed words at all, sat together beside the table while the snowlight filled the diner window. Later, when coffee had been poured and soup had gone cold because no one could eat much, the story came in pieces. June explained how Marissa had visited them after Walter's stroke, calm and helpful, saying Nate was unstable, ashamed, unreachable by choice. She said medical advice was to avoid emotional pressure. She said Nate had signed financial papers to protect the family from debt. She said the house had to be transferred temporarily, then permanently. Then it was too late to question without lawyers they could not afford. Walter admitted, with visible pain, that he had believed some of it because he had wanted to believe Marissa was protecting Nate. "I was sick," he said, each word slow. "But not blind. Should have fought." Nate shook his head. "No." Walter's jaw tightened. Nate leaned closer. "No, Dad. She used all of us." June reached across the table and took Nate's hand. Elena sat beside him, following what she could from faces and fragments, while Mabel quietly summarized in signs she knew and wrote short notes when needed. Nate noticed that Elena did not ask to be included. People included her, because that was what respect looked like in this little corner of the diner. At some point, Nate took out the folded note Elena had written the day before. "Maybe someone was waiting for you. Maybe the message never reached the right door." He placed it beside the letters. June read it and looked at Elena. "Thank you," she said clearly, making sure Elena could see her mouth. Elena nodded, then signed the same word back. Nate watched her hand move. He had practiced that sign in secret the night before, badly, over and over in the garage room, until Valor grew bored and slept through his effort. Now, with his parents at the table and Elena across from him, Nate lifted his hand. He pointed to himself first, then shaped the signs slowly, awkwardly. "I want to stand straight again." Elena's eyes widened slightly. The motion was not perfect. He knew it wasn't. His wrist was too stiff, his fingers uncertain. But she understood. So did June, though not the exact words. Mothers often understood the shape of a son's plea even before language reached it. Elena leaned across the table. Gently, she adjusted the angle of Nate's hand, not correcting him like a teacher with a student, but like someone helping a person tune an instrument. Then she signed it back to him, clean and steady. "I want to stand straight again." Nate repeated it. Better this time. Walter watched, one hand still resting on Valor's head. His father nodded once. Not because everything had been fixed. Nothing had been fixed yet. The house was still locked. The papers were still tangled. Marissa's story still lay across town like a thin sheet of ice. But the deepest lie had cracked. Nate had not come home to no one. He had come home through a storm of missing letters, false messages, fear, sickness, shame, and silence. And here, in a diner full of soup steam and winter light, the people who had waited for him were finally close enough to touch. Nate did not go back to Callahan Road with his father's anger in his hands. That surprised him. There had been a time, not long ago, when finding the letters would have been enough to send him straight to the gate. He could picture it too easily. His truck sliding to a stop in the snow, Valor at his side, his fist against the iron bars, his voice carrying up the drive until Marissa came out and the neighbors pretended not to watch. But after the reunion at Mabel's table, anger no longer stood alone. It had company now. His mother's small hand gripping his sleeve, his father's damaged voice saying, "You came back." Elena's note folded inside his folder. Valor's head resting on Walter's knee as if the dog had known exactly where the silence hurt most. Those things made anger heavier. They made it less useful as a weapon. So when Walter said, "We go there," the next morning, Nate shook his head. They were sitting in the corner of Mabel's diner before opening hours. The windows were fogged at the edges. Mabel moved behind the counter, pretending not to listen, while listening to every word. June held a mug of tea with both hands. Walter sat stiffly beside her, his wool coat still on, as if he expected to leave at any second. "No," Nate said. Walter's jaw clenched. "She lied." "I know. She took your mother's house. She took more than that." "Then we go." Nate looked at his father's weakened hand resting on the table, fingers curled slightly from the stroke. He remembered those hands guiding boards through the saw in the old shop, lifting him onto the porch roof to help patch shingles, tightening around his shoulder the day he left for training. Now one of those hands trembled when Walter got tired. Nate spoke carefully. "If I show up angry, she wins the first round before we start." Walter's eyes flashed. "You afraid?" The question landed hard, but Nate did not flinch. "Yes," he said. That quiet answer changed the room. Walter blinked. Nate looked down at the folder on the table. "I'm afraid of becoming the man she told everyone I am." June's face folded with pain. Elena, seated across from him with her notebook open, watched his mouth and then lowered her gaze to the page. She wrote something, turned it toward him. "Fear can be information, not an order." Nate read it once, then again. Mabel set a plate of toast on the table with more force than necessary. "That woman upstairs is smarter before coffee than half this town after church." Elena looked toward Mabel, caught enough of the expression to understand the tone, and smiled faintly. By noon, Elena had made a call. The woman she brought to Mabel's that afternoon arrived in a gray wool coat, red wine scarf, and shoes entirely unsuited to icy sidewalks, but somehow untouched by slush. She was in her 60s, small but straight-backed, with short silver hair and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck. She carried a leather folder under one arm and looked around the diner as if every table might be hiding a poorly written affidavit. "This is Harriet Sloane," Elena wrote for Nate before the woman reached them. Harriet did not wait for Nate to stand fully before offering her hand. "Nathaniel Callahan," she said. "I knew your father when he still believed yelling at lumber made it straighter." Walter gave a rough sound that might have been a laugh. Harriet turned to him. "Walter." He nodded. "Harriet." That was apparently a greeting between people who had once known each other well enough to skip politeness. Harriet had been a property attorney in Montpelier for 3 decades before retiring to White Harbor, though Mabel later muttered that retirement, in Harriet's case, meant correcting everyone else's paperwork for free and complaining about it. She did not promise miracles. In fact, the first thing she did after reading through Nate's thin folder was remove her glasses, rub the bridge of her nose, and say, "This will be unpleasant." Nate almost smiled. "That's the good news?" "That is the honest news." Harriet tapped the papers. "If your wife used a valid power of attorney, parts of this may take months to unwind. If she exceeded its scope, that helps. If signatures were misrepresented, that helps more. But paper has a way of protecting the person holding the better copy." Elena, who had been watching closely, wrote in her notebook and showed Nate. "She means do not expect justice to move like a movie." Harriet glanced at the note and said, "Exactly." "I like her." Elena's eyes brightened. For the next 2 hours, Harriet turned the table into a battlefield of documents, but not the kind Nate understood. Dates became positions. Notary stamps became weak points. Missing attachments became open ground. She asked where Nate had been on specific days. Lucas Bellamy faxed service records from Burlington. June found an old calendar in her purse with medical appointments marked around the time Marissa claimed Walter and June had agreed to leave the house voluntarily. By late afternoon, Harriet had circled 3 dates in red. "This notarization," she said, pointing to one scanned page, "appears to have been processed when you were not in Vermont." "I was at Fort Carson that week," Nate said. "Can you prove it?" "Probably." "No, probably. We need yes." He nodded. She pointed to another page. "This signature looks similar to yours, but not consistent with the signature on the original limited authorization. It may be a scan, it may be nothing, it may be everything." Nate looked at Elena. Elena's expression remained calm, but he saw the same thing in her eyes she had written days earlier. Not clean. Harriet continued. "And this attachment is referenced but missing. Whoever drafted the final transfer expected no one to ask for the complete file." "Can we get it?" June asked. "We can request it." Harriet put her glasses back on. Whether they hand it over politely depends on how confident they feel. Walter made a low sound. Harriet turned to him. "No threatening anyone, Walter." "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking loudly." For a moment, the table breathed easier. Then Harriet said, "There is one person I want to speak with before the town meeting." "What town meeting?" Nate asked. Harriet looked at him over her glasses. "The one where Graham Voss is presenting his proposal to convert your family home into a winter lodging property." Nate went still. June closed her eyes. Walter's good hand curled into a fist. Harriet's voice stayed even. "He filed a preliminary request weeks ago. It is not final. It is public. And if we are careful, it gives us a room full of witnesses without forcing us to trespass on your former property." Former. The word cut. Harriet noticed. "Legally contested property," she corrected. "For now." The person Harriet wanted to speak with was Diane Rusk. Diane worked part-time at the town records office now, though she had once been an assistant at the notary service that processed several of Marissa's documents. Harriet found her 2 days later in a narrow municipal office that smelled of toner, wet coats, and old file cabinets. Nate waited outside in the hall because Harriet told him his presence would make things harder. He hated that she was right. Elena waited with him. Valor lay between them, head on his paws, eyes following every person who passed. Through the frosted glass door, Nate could see only blurred shapes: Harriet's small, straight figure, Diane's hunched outline behind a desk. When the door finally opened, Diane stepped out first. She was in her late 50s, thin, with tired eyes and hair pulled back so tightly it made her face look more severe than it was. She wore a brown cardigan and held a tissue crushed in one hand. She looked at Nate once, then away. "I didn't know," she said. Nate stood. Harriet came out behind her. "Mrs. Rusk is willing to provide a written statement." Diane swallowed. "Marissa said she had full authority. She had the papers. She said Mr. Callahan was unreachable and unstable, and that delays would put the family at financial risk." Her voice thinned. "I should have checked the attachments. I should have asked for the original signatures." Nate had expected to feel satisfaction. He did not. Diane looked like someone who had spent years telling herself a small mistake was harmless, because the alternative was admitting it had helped ruin lives. Walter and June had been pushed out by lies. Nate had been erased by signatures. And here stood a woman who had not forged anything, not plotted anything, not hated anyone, but had looked away just long enough for harm to pass through her hands.
Nate said, "Why are you helping now?" Diane's eyes filled. "Because I saw your mother in town yesterday." She folded the tissue harder. "She thanked me for holding the door at the pharmacy. She didn't know who I was." The answer was small. It was also human. Nate nodded once. "Thank you." Diane looked as if she did not deserve the words. Maybe she didn't. But Nate had not come here to become cruel. The town meeting was held in the community hall on Thursday evening. By then, nearly everyone in White Harbor seemed to know something was coming, though few knew what. Trucks filled the snowy lot. People stamped ice from their boots at the entrance. Folding chairs lined the hall beneath fluorescent lights and faded banners from past winter festivals. A long table stood at the front for the planning board. Graham Voss arrived early. He wore a navy suit under a black overcoat, a scarf arranged with effortless care, and carried a thin leather portfolio. He moved through the room shaking hands, smiling warmly, speaking of preservation, investment, local jobs, winter tourism. Beside him stood Marissa, in a camel coat, pearl earrings, and a composed expression that did not falter when Nate entered. But her eyes changed. Only for a second. Enough. Nate walked in with Walter, June, Elena, Harriet, and Valor. He had chosen his clothes carefully, not to impress, but to deny anyone the easy picture of him Marissa had painted. Dark jeans, clean boots Otis had helped polish with insulting commentary. A gray sweater under his old field jacket. His face clean-shaven as always, hair trimmed, dog tag beneath his shirt. Valor wore his plain brown collar. No vest, no symbols of threat, just a dog at his side. A murmur passed through the room. Nate felt it move over him. The old instinct told him to identify exits, assess angles, measure distance between himself and every hostile body. He did all of that without turning his head. Then he looked at Elena. She signed slowly. "Breathe." He did. The first half of the meeting belonged to Graham. He spoke well, Nate had to give him that. He described the Callahan property as underutilized, the old house as architecturally charming, the woodshop as convertible, the lake view as an opportunity for sustainable winter lodging. He never used the word family, not once. He showed clean renderings on a projector. Warm windows, guests with skis, restored beams, a tasteful sign that read, "The Callahan Lodge." June made a small sound. Nate reached under the table and took her hand. Walter stared at the screen as if watching someone wear his dead father's coat. Then the board chair asked for public comment. Harriet went first. She did not accuse, she did not dramatize. She simply presented enough. Questions regarding the authority used in the property transfers, inconsistencies in notarization dates, missing attachments, a forthcoming statement from a former notary assistant, and a request that any development decision be delayed until the ownership issues were reviewed. The room shifted. Paper had entered the space where rumor had been living. Graham's smile thinned. "With respect, these are private family matters and not relevant to a preliminary land use discussion." Nate stood before Harriet could answer. Every head turned. For a moment, the room blurred at the edges. He could feel Marissa watching him, waiting, perhaps, for his voice to rise, for his grief to become a spectacle, for the old story to prove useful again. Valor stood too, not forward, not tense, beside him. Nate placed one hand lightly on the dog's head. "My name is Nathaniel Callahan," he said. The microphone made his voice sound unfamiliar but steady. "I served away from this town for a long time. When I returned, I found the gate to my family home locked, my name removed from the mailbox, my parents gone, and my wife standing inside with another man." A few people looked down. He continued. "I was told everything was legal. I was told my parents left because they could no longer watch what I had become. I believed part of that because I had not been easy to reach. I had been wounded in ways that do not always show up on a body. The hall remained very quiet. But my parents were writing to me. Their letters were returned. They were told I did not want them. I was told they had given up on me. That was not a misunderstanding. That was a wall built between us. Marissa's face had gone pale. Nate did not look at her. I am not here to ask this town to feel sorry for me. I am not here to shout. I am here because a house is not just wood when people are removed from it by lies. A name on a deed matters. A name on a mailbox matters. A story told about a man when he is not present to answer matters. Elena rose beside him. A local interpreter, one of her adult students from the community center, stepped forward from the second row. She was a middle-aged woman with cropped black hair and a nervous but determined expression. Elena signed, her movements clear and deliberate. The interpreter spoke aloud. A person who loses a house can sometimes find another place to sleep, but a person who has the truth taken from him may no longer know where to stand. No one moved. Even Graham stopped arranging his papers. Nate looked across the room then and saw something change. Not belief, not fully, but doubt. Doubt was enough for one night. Doubt could thaw a road. Marissa stood. Nate has struggled for years, she said, voice soft, controlled. I tried to protect this family from decisions he was not capable of making. The old trap opened at his feet. Nate felt it. Valor sat, calmly, deliberately. The dog's amber eyes faced the room, not Marissa. His body leaned lightly against Nate's leg, steady as a post. Nate did not defend himself with anger. He said only, "Then let the documents be reviewed." Marissa had no answer ready for something that simple. The board chair cleared his throat. After brief discussion, the board voted to table Graham's proposal until the ownership questions and documentation concerns were formally reviewed. It was not a victory in the way people imagined victories. No one confessed. No one was led away. The gate did not open. The deed did not change hands. But Graham's project stopped moving. For the first time since Nate had come home, someone with authority had said, "Wait." Outside, the night was cold and clear. Snow fell lightly beneath the street lamps, each flake visible for a second before vanishing into the dark wool of coats and hats. People passed Nate differently now. Not warmly, not all of them, but less certainly. A few nodded. One man from the hardware store looked as if he wanted to say something and did not know how. Walter stood near the steps with June tucked under his good arm. Harriet was already speaking to Lucas about records requests. Mabel had somehow appeared with a thermos and was forcing coffee on anyone too slow to escape. Elena came to stand beside Nate. She waited until he looked at her. Then she signed, slowly enough for him to follow. "Are you all right?" Nate looked back at the hall. Through the windows, he could see Marissa and Graham speaking tensely near the front table. Their world had not collapsed. Not yet. Maybe it never would, in a clean, satisfying way. But something had shifted. He looked at Elena and answered with hands that still felt clumsy, but no longer foreign. Not yet. He paused, making sure he shaped the next part correctly. But I am not hiding anymore. Elena's face softened. Valor leaned against Nate's leg, warm and solid in the falling snow. Nate stood there beneath the winter lights, shoulders squared, breathing visible in the cold, and realized that he had walked out of a room full of people without lowering his head. For tonight, that was enough. The review took longer than Hope wanted. That was one of the first lessons Nate learned after the town meeting. Truth could stand up in a crowded room and still needs signatures, certified copies, official requests, and people willing to say on paper
what they had once whispered in private. Winter deepened around White Harbor while the process moved at its own stubborn pace. Harriet Sloan filed requests. Lucas Bellamy helped Nate gather service records and timelines. Diane Rusk provided a statement about the notary files she had processed without properly verifying the attachments. Walter and June gave Harriet every letter they had kept, every envelope marked returned, every note Marissa had sent them explaining why Nate supposedly needed distance. Elena made copies, organized dates, and labeled folders with a precision that made Harriet nod in rare approval. Nate worked when he could. He still slept in the room behind Otis's garage at first, though June hated that and said so every morning by trying to feed him enough breakfast for 3 men. Valor moved between them all like a quiet thread, sleeping beside Nate at night, resting his head on Walter's knee in the diner, and following Elena's hand signals with increasing confidence. Nothing happened dramatically. No sheriff arrived to drag anyone away. No judge slammed a gavel and restored the world in a single afternoon. Instead, Graham Voss's proposal stalled under review. His smile grew thinner at public meetings. His calls to the planning office became less friendly. Then one morning, Harriet walked into Mabel's table, set a folder on the counter, and said, "He withdrew." Mabel, who was pouring coffee, stopped. "Who withdrew what?" "Graham Voss withdrew the lodging proposal." June pressed a hand to her chest. Walter stared at Harriet. "Why?" Harriet removed her glasses and wiped them with a cloth. "Because proceeding would invite scrutiny into the chain of title, and scrutiny is apparently less charming than lakefront hospitality." Nate sat very still. Elena, across from him, read Harriet's mouth, then looked to Nate before Mabel could summarize. She understood enough. Her hand moved beneath the table, signing one word: breathe. Nate did. More came in pieces after that. The transfer documents were not simply messy, they were compromised. The original authorization Nate had signed years earlier had been limited. Later documents had stretched that authority far beyond its legal shape. Some attachments were missing. Some copies showed signs of improper insertion. One notarized page was dated when Nate could prove he had been out of state. Diane's statement did not solve everything, but it broke the appearance of clean legality. Marissa's attorney, seeing the same cracks Harriet saw, chose settlement over exposure. The agreement did not give Nate everything at once. It did not erase the years or punish every wrong. But Marissa signed away control of the Callahan house, the old woodshop, and a portion of the lakeside property. Certain accounts would be reviewed separately. Graham's name disappeared from the future of the place. Harriet called it a practical result. Mabel called it not enough, but a start. Walter called it nothing at all. He only sat back in the booth, closed his eyes, and covered June's hand with his good one. Nate did not know what to call it. Victory felt too clean. Relief felt too small. The first time he returned to the house after the settlement, he did not go alone. Walter insisted on coming, though the snow was deep and the path had iced over near the porch. June came with a thermos, 2 scarves, and a tin of cookies, because she believed emotional ruin should never be faced on an empty stomach. Elena came quietly, not assuming a place in the family, but not standing outside it either. Valor rode in the back seat with his head between Nate and Walter, as if making sure neither man changed his mind. The new lock was gone. Harriet had arranged that. Still, Nate stood at the gate longer than he needed to. The old iron bars were cold beneath his hand. The black plaque with Voss Property Management had been removed from the mailbox. Beneath the holes where it had been screwed in, the metal was scratched and weather-stained. For a moment, Nate imagined putting the Callahan name back exactly where it had been. Then he realized he was not sure he wanted to. Walter noticed him looking. "Doesn't have to be today," his father said. Nate turned. Walter's words were slow but clear. "No," Nate said. "It doesn't."
They walked up the drive. The house stood under a pale winter sky, larger and smaller than memory at the same time. The porch sagged slightly on the left. The windows needed washing. Someone had removed June's blue curtains, but the outline where their rods had been still marked the wood. The front door opened with a sound Nate remembered so sharply that his throat tightened. Inside, the air smelled wrong. Too much polish, too little wood smoke, too little life. Marissa had left furniture, but not warmth. The rooms were staged, neat, arranged by taste rather than habit. The old bench in the hall was gone. The framed photograph of Nate in uniform was gone. Walter's tools no longer hung near the back entry. June stood in the living room and looked around as if she had entered a house pretending to be hers. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "That makes it worse." No one argued. They moved through the rooms slowly. The staircase still creaked on the third step. The kitchen window still looked toward the frozen lake. The pantry door still stuck unless lifted before pulling. Small survivals, small betrayals. Walter lowered himself into a chair at the kitchen table, though it was not their old table. His fingers rested on the smooth surface. "I thought I wanted this room back," he said. June stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. Nate waited. Walter looked toward the window. Snow drifted beyond the glass, bright and gentle. "I don't need this room to be your father." The words took effort. Each one seemed pulled from deep inside him. Nate felt them land. June wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. "I don't need the walls, either," she said. "I need dinner with my son, where my letters don't come back unopened." Nate turned away before his face showed too much. Valor walked to the corner where the old stove used to be. He sniffed the floor, then returned to Nate without settling. Even the dog did not seem to recognize the place as home. That was when Nate understood. Getting the house back did not mean going backward. It meant choosing what the house would become, now that the lie had been removed from its door. The old wood shop made the decision easier. Behind the house, half buried in snow and shadow, stood the building Nate had missed more than he expected. Its roof needed repair, one window was cracked. The double doors had swollen in the cold and fought him when he tried to open them. But inside, beneath dust and neglect, the bones remained. Workbenches, pegboard, a long scar in the floor where his father's table saw had once stood, a rack for clamps, empty now, a narrow shelf along the back wall where Nate used to hide bent nails and call them treasures. Walter stood in the doorway, breathing hard from the walk. June tucked her scarf tighter around her neck. Elena stepped in last, her eyes moving over the wood, the windows, the light. Nate watched her face. She saw damage, but not failure. He knew that look now. "This could be a shop again," Nate said. Walter gave a faint grunt. "Could be." Elena took out her notebook. Her fingers were pink from the cold. She wrote, then showed it to Nate. "Not only a shop." Nate looked at her. She pointed toward the old workbench, then made a careful sign he had learned recently. "Together." The idea did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like warmth returning to numb hands. Over the next weeks, the plan changed shape a dozen times. At first, Nate thought only of repairing the shop so Walter could sit there again, so June could have a reason to come out with coffee, so his family name would mean making rather than losing. Then Elena suggested moving some of her restoration work there during the spring, when the light would be better and the space could hold larger frames. Lucas mentioned veterans in the county who needed work placements that did not feel like charity. Harriet knew a grant writer. Mabel knew everyone who owned spare chairs, spare lamps, spare opinions, and spare time. Otis inspected the electrical panel, declared it a crime scene, and came back the next day with wiring tools.
By late winter, the old wood shop had become something no one person could have designed alone. One half held workbenches for wood repair, frame making, and small furniture restoration. The other half became Elena's satellite studio, with tables for damaged paintings and old family photographs. A wide board near the door displayed hand-drawn signs for basic ASL: hello, help, thank you, coffee, dog, slow down. Mabel insisted that coffee deserved a larger sign. Walter practiced with valor. That became one of Nate's favorite things to witness. His father, who still fought for certain words, learned to call the dog with 2 fingers and a low tap against his leg. Valor answered every time. Walter's smile when the German shepherd came and sat before him was not large, but it made June turn away more than once to hide her tears. The house itself changed, too. Not all of it became theirs in the old way. Nate kept the rooms Walter and June needed warm, simple, and full of familiar things. June hung curtains she chose herself, not the old blue ones, but soft cream ones that caught winter light. Walter's chair went near the kitchen window. The rest of the house remained partly empty, waiting for purpose. Nate discovered he liked emptiness when it was honest. Marissa came to the gate on a gray afternoon just before the first thaw. Nate saw her from the shop window. She stood outside the iron bars in a pale coat, hair loosened slightly by the wind. No Graham beside her. No leather folder. No controlled audience. For the first time since he had come home, she looked less like a woman managing a room, and more like someone who had reached the edge of a life she had chosen, and found it colder than expected. Valor stood when Nate reached for his jacket, but Nate held up one hand. "Stay." The dog watched him. Nate signed it, too, partly from habit now. "Stay." Valor obeyed, though reluctantly. Nate walked to the gate alone. Marissa looked at him through the bars, the same bars that had stood between them on the first day. For a moment, neither spoke. "I signed," she said finally. "I know. My attorney said you'll receive the final copies next week." Nate nodded. She looked past him toward the house, then the shop. "You're really not selling?" "No." "Graham said the property could still be worth—" "I don't care what Graham said." Her mouth tightened, then softened. She looked older than 48 in that moment. Not ruined. Not punished enough for anyone hungry for spectacle. Just smaller, somehow, without the story she had used to stand taller. "I did love you," she said. Nate looked at her. The snow had begun to fall again, very lightly, almost rain. "I know," he said. That seemed to hurt her more than denial would have. "I got tired," she whispered. "Of waiting. Of being afraid every time the phone rang. Of not knowing whether the man coming home would still be my husband." Nate let the words stand. They were true, perhaps. They were not enough. "You should have left me honestly," he said. Marissa closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears in them, but Nate no longer felt responsible for carrying them. "I'm sorry." He believed she was. He also knew belief was not forgiveness. "There are things that don't go back," he said, "no matter how sorry anyone is." She nodded. "I don't expect you to forgive me." "Good," Nate said, not cruelly, "because I don't know if I can." Her face trembled once. He looked past her toward the road out of White Harbor. "But I'm not giving you the rest of my life by hating you every morning." For a long moment, Marissa did not move. Then she stepped back from the gate. "Goodbye, Nate." He nodded once. "Marissa." She walked away through the light snow, and this time Nate did not feel the urge to follow the past down the road. When he returned to the shop,
Valor met him at the door and pressed his nose into Nate's palm. Nate bent and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's head. "I'm all right," he said. And for once, the words felt close to true. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in dripping eaves, softer roads, mud near the garage, and the first afternoon when the shop door could stay open without freezing everyone inside. But winter gave them one last bright day. Snow fell lightly over White Harbor. Not storm snow, not punishing snow, but the kind that seemed to polish the air. The workshop glowed with warm light. Inside, people moved between tables. A former truck driver learning to sand a frame evenly, a woman from Elena's ASL class labeling jars, Lucas helping fill out volunteer forms, Otis pretending not to enjoy himself while fixing a hinge that did not need fixing. Mabel's laugh carried up from the diner supplies she had brought in a basket. Elena stood near the front table, guiding a small group of adults through basic signs. Her hands moved clearly in the golden light. "Slow down. Again. Thank you." She glanced toward Nate when one of the students accidentally signed coffee instead of help, and her eyes filled with silent amusement. Nate stood by the wall, a carpenter's pencil tucked behind his ear, sawdust on the sleeve of his gray sweater. June had hung 2 photographs near the door that morning. One was old, Nate in uniform, younger, sharper, trying to look brave enough for the people who loved him. The other was new, Nate in the shop, sleeves rolled, one hand on Valor's back. Elena beside him, smiling with her eyes. Walter and June behind them, close enough to touch. No one looked perfect. Walter leaned slightly. June's hair had escaped its pins. Nate's sweater was dusted with wood. Valor's left ear scar showed clearly. It was the better picture. Walter stood near the workbench, practicing a sign with Valor. His fingers moved slowly. "Come." Valor rose from his place by the door and crossed to him at once. Walter laughed. The sound was rough, uneven, and wonderful. Nate watched his father put a hand on the dog's head and felt the old ache in him shift into something he could live with. Elena came to stand beside him. She did not take his hand. Not yet. Instead, her shoulder touched his lightly, a question with no pressure inside it. Nate let his shoulder rest back. Through the open shop door, the old house stood beyond the yard, no longer a monument to what had been taken. Smoke rose from its chimney. Warm curtains glowed in the windows. It was not the same home he had left years ago. Neither was he the same man. Maybe that was why it could finally hold him again. Mabel shouted from somewhere inside, "If nobody eats this soup while it's hot, I'm retiring from kindness." Otis answered, "You keep threatening us with peace." Elena laughed without sound. Valor returned to the doorway and lay down across the threshold, front paws stretched, head high, guarding nothing and everyone at once. Nate looked at the people inside the shop, at the tools on the wall, at the damaged things waiting to be repaired, at the hands learning to speak in more than one language. For years he had imagined home as a place that would remember him exactly as he had been. He knew better now. Home was not always the place waiting unchanged at the end of war. Sometimes home was what people built after the old door had locked them out. Sometimes it smelled like sawdust, soup, wet wool, and paint. Sometimes it began with a returned letter. Sometimes it needed no grand promise, only a room full of people willing to stay. Nate reached down and touched the worn metal of his dog tag beneath his sweater. Callahan. Then he picked up the carpenter's pencil from behind his ear and turned back to the workbench. There was still so much to repair. And for the first time in a long time, that did not feel like a burden. It felt like a life. Sometimes home is not the place that stayed unchanged while we were gone. Sometimes home is what God helps us rebuild after loss, betrayal, silence, and long seasons of waiting.
Nate did not get his old life back exactly as it was, but through loyalty, truth, family, and quiet grace, he found something deeper, a place where broken people could stand again. So if you are walking through a season where something precious feels lost, may this story remind you that the final door has not closed. Grace can still meet you in small ways, through one faithful friend, one honest voice, one returned letter, or one person who chooses to stay. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories of hope, healing, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May peace find you wherever you are tonight.